Quorum being present, the Subcommittee on National Security and Foreign Affairs hearing entitled Made in the USA Manufacturing Policy, the Defense Industrial Base and United States National Security will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that only the Chairman and Ranking Member, Mr. Foster, of the Subcommittee be allowed to make opening statements. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the hearing record be kept open for 5 business days so that all members of the Subcommittee will be allowed to submit a written statement for the record. Without objection, that's so ordered as well. So again, good morning, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being here. Today, the Subcommittee turns its attention to a matter that has far-reaching consequences for both our economy and our national security, the United States manufacturing and defense industrial base. For decades, manufacturing has been the backbone of the American economy. The United States has been known as the land of innovation, the home of the car, the computer, and the jet plane. These innovations lead to good jobs for hardworking Americans. American manufacturing is also a bastion of quality where the words "Made in America" signify superior craftsmanship, durability, and value. However, despite the importance of innovation and manufacturing to our national economy, manufacturing jobs have been dropping steadily over the last several decades. Right after World War II, manufacturing accounted for 40% of the American jobs. Today, that number is closer to 11%. While the decrease in manufacturing affects many aspects of the United States economy, today we will focus on one area in particular, the defense industrial base. The decrease in manufacturing at home has forced the Department of Defense to look abroad to acquire the tools it needs to arm our forces and provide for our national security. Outsourcing takes control of our supply chain out of our hands, and when foreign companies or governments control the production of necessary parts, our critical defense needs are subject to geopolitical forces that are beyond our control. Now, as far back as May of 2003 in the 108th Congress, I've been focusing on this issue, and I remember that during consideration of the fiscal year 2004 Defense Authorization Bill, I offered an amendment that sought to expand the scope of the Defense Industrial Base Assessment Program, and it was included in the committee-approved bill. It required additional information on why contracts are transferred outside this country. It would have mandated an action plan on how our defense manufacturing sector can be revitalized and restored. In fact, the amendment was approved by a voice vote, and it had the support of the then Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Republican Duncan Hunter. But opposition from the Bush administration caused it to be stripped from the final version, and the regrettable effect of that was that the Defense Industrial Base Assessment Program wasn't nearly as effective as I think it should have been. The following year, I went a step further, and I offered an amendment to the fiscal year 2005 Defense Authorization Bill that was aimed at keeping taxpayer-supported defense jobs here in this country. My amendment would have required the Secretary of Defense, as a condition of any defense-related manufacturing contract, to mandate that the contract perform substantially all or in no event less than 65% of defense-related manufacturing services in the United States. The provision allowed the Secretary of Defense to waive that requirement in cases where the products and services were not available in the United States or if national security concerns necessitated a waiver. Unfortunately, the then Republican-led Rules Committee prevented the amendment from receiving a vote on the House floor. But we've had a number of examples where relying on foreign companies has been detrimental. For example, in 2003, a Swiss company decided to delay delivery of essential parts of the Pentagon's Joint Direct Attack Munitions, the JDAMs, commonly known as smart bombs due to their ability to pinpoint targets, because of Swiss government's opposition to the Iraq War. Not only did this force the Defense Department to acquire these parts at a higher price, there was a significant delay in getting these munitions to our forces overseas. Further, it's only when critical parts are made in America that we can be sure that the quality meets our needs. There have been countless situations where the Department of Defense has received foreign parts that did not meet its quality standards, including substandard and counterfeit materials. In one example, seatbelt clasps purchased by the United States Army would break when it accidentally dropped because they were fabricated from a substandard grade of aluminum. One particularly salient example of our dependence on foreign countries to supply us with essential materials used for defense is our need for rare earth materials. These metals are used for making a wide range of commercial and defense applications, including the engines of the F-14, F-15, and F-16 fighter jets. Such materials are also critical components of high-tech computer chips, cell phones, and smart bombs that are hallmarks of warfighting in the information age. China produces, and therefore controls, 97% of rare earth oxides. It would take about 15 years to establish a domestic supply chain, and the national security implications of this imbalance are impossible to ignore. We also face significant workforce training and capacity issues. The Government Accountability Office has consistently reported that there are not enough highly skilled workers to perform the critical tasks needed to sustain our industrial base. We have more people retiring than entering the workforce, which means companies that want to build in America cannot find workers with the right skills to do so. As such, we will have to invest in our education system as well as our training programs. We must also look at our manufacturing capacity and ensure that we have modern, technologically advanced facilities that can respond to both civilian and defense needs. We need smart policies that assure that a skilled manufacturing workforce has the flexible capacity to shift between defense, public works, and commercial activity as the times demand. Creating a robust manufacturing sector also requires careful consideration of tax, trade, innovation, and regulatory policies. I want to stress that this is not about protectionism or stifling free trade. It is about being competitive. I applaud the House for passing H.R. 4692, which would require each President to develop a national manufacturing strategy and assess progress. I encourage the Senate to do the same. We can no longer afford to jeopardize our economy, the livelihood of Americans, or our national security by ignoring the manufacturing sector. Modernizing and improving our industrial base will ultimately improve our economy, provide better employment opportunities to Americans, and strengthen national security. We have to start to think strategically about the industrial challenges we face and take aggressive action to fully address them. Our economic and national security demand it. And with that, I would like to ask Mr. Luetkemeyer for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panelists today. The debate today raises important questions about how traditional free market principles coincide with national security concerns. While the United States sometimes relies on foreign labor and equipment because it can provide cheaper alternatives to domestic sources, the result at times can be less than ideal. The sensitivity and quality of foreign-made equipment are valid concerns. Does this mean that all military equipment should be produced within the United States? We should consider whether a logical balance can be struck. Sensitive equipment should be made either in the United States or in collaboration with our closest allies. For non-sensitive equipment, we should employ greater quality controls and more stringent oversight of foreign products. I believe we should go a step further and examine the policies that drive business offshore to begin with. We should examine whether Congress and the Administration need to reform corporate tax rates, labor policies, and environmental regulations so that they are conducive to domestic industrial growth. Creating an environment within which businesses will naturally thrive will go a long way toward bolstering the domestic industrial base. Whichever path we take, we must also be mindful of likely retaliation as a factor if we choose a path that many of our trading partners will construe as protectionist and violation of international trade agreements. Mr. Chairman, thank you for coming to this hearing. I look forward to today's testimony.
Thank you. The subcommittee will now receive testimony from the panel before us today. Before we do that, Mr. Foster has an opening statement. Mr. Foster, we invite you to present that.
I'd like to thank the Chairman, and I'd also like to introduce a graph, which I think often a picture is worth tens of thousands of words, and this graph, which will, I hope will be visible to our panel.
Without objection, it's entered on the record.
This is simply a plot of manufacturing employment in the United States from 1973 till today. And it was remarkably constant for 30 years, from the early 70s until early 2001. It was basically 17 to 18 million. Didn't matter who was in charge, good times and bad, Democrats, Republicans. It was relatively healthy. During this period, of course, industrial output more than doubled because of increases in productivity and technology. But in early 2001, a cataclysm overtook us, and more than a third of our manufacturing jobs have been lost. And this is not and should not be a partisan issue. We were able for decades to keep healthy manufacturing going in the United States. Of course, businesses grew, businesses failed, sectors increased and decreased. But overall, we stayed relatively healthy. But something very bad happened starting in early 2001, and as a country, we have to understand what it was that did that. It wasn't a single cause. It was a number of things. We have to understand how to reverse this. And I, as someone who started a manufacturing company when I was 19, actually back right around 1973, I started a company that now provides hundreds of manufacturing jobs in the Midwest and has competed and exports a very high fraction of our production. And we are faced every single trade show we go to. We are worried that one of our competitors will have offshored their production and be undercutting us. And so we have to understand things like currency manipulation that we ought to be able to fix, and things like labor arbitrage, which are going to be very tough. And so we have to have an honest national discussion about this, and we have to decide what fraction of things like national defense, frankly, trump mindless free trade points of view, and that there be certain things that we're going to have to be able to do. It has to be a national goal that after an electromagnetic pulse event that wipes out all of our electronics, that we have the ability by ourselves to recover our capacity to communicate in this country. And things like that have to be thought out and very consciously separated. Anyway, this is a wonderful hearing, and I thank the Chairman for having it.
Thank you, Mr. Foster. Now the subcommittee will receive testimony from the panel before us today. At first, I'll introduce the panel. Mr. Jeff Foe is the founding president and a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. Mr. Foe has studied, taught, and published on a wide variety of economic and political issues, and is the author or co-author of 5 books. He also has worked as an economist in the Departments of State, Labor, and Commerce, as a manager in the finance industry, as a blueberry farmer, and as a member of the Municipal Planning Board in the state of Maine. He sits on the boards of several nonprofit institutions and magazines, has written articles for numerous newspapers and journals, and regularly appears on television and radio. Mr. Foe holds a B.A. from Queens College, an M.A. from George Washington University, and an honorary degree from the University of New England. Mr. Robert Baugh is the Executive Director of the Industrial Union Council of the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the AFL-CIO. The Council, comprised of the nation's leading industrial unions and chaired by the AFL-CIO President, is the coordinating body for the AFL-CIO's manufacturing, policy, and legislative initiatives. Mr. Baugh is also the co-chair of the AFL-CIO Energy Task Force and served as the leader of the United States Labor Delegation to the UN Climate Change Conference negotiations in Bali, Boston, and Copenhagen. Mr. Baugh is also the author of several publications on issues ranging from economic development to manufacturing and climate change. He holds a B.A. from the University of Detroit and an M.A. in Industrial and Labor Relations from the University of Oregon. Mr. Mark Gordon serves as the Executive Committee of the National Defense Industrial Association and is the Director for Defense Programs at the National Center for Advanced Technologies, where he covers all technology, manufacturing, and research and development policy topics. He also heads the Evolutionary Acquisition Training Team, which provides an industry perspective to the Department of Defense technical and policy groups on acquisition policy. Additionally, Mr. Gordon sits on the Joint Defense Manufacturing Technology Panel as the Defense Industry Representative and is a member of the Diminishing Manufacturing Sources and Material Shortages Working Group on the Department of Defense. He is a board member of the National Center for the Defense Manufacturing and Machining and a member of the National Defense Industry Association Manufacturing Division Executive Committee. For the purposes of full disclosure, Mr. Gordon is also under government contract as an industry liaison for strategic planning initiatives involving technology transition mechanisms within the Department of Defense. He holds a Master and an M.A. from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Mr. Michael Wessel is a member of the United States Economic and Security Review Commission, a senior advisor at the Alliance for American Manufacturing, and president of the Wessel Group, a public affairs consulting firm. He is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a staff advisor to the Labor Advisory Committee to the United States Trade Representative, and previously served on the United States Trade Deficit Review Commission from 1999 to 2000. Mr. Wessel worked for House Majority Leader Richard Gephardt for more than 20 years. In addition to serving as General Counsel, he also served as Mr. Gephardt's principal Ways and Means aide, participating in the enactment of major trade policy initiatives, and as the Executive Director of the House Trade and Competitiveness Task Force. Mr. Wessel holds a B.A. and a J.D. from George Washington University. So thank you to all of our witnesses for making yourselves available today and for sharing your substantial expertise. It's the policy of this committee to swear you in before you testify, so I ask that you please stand and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. The record will please reflect that all the witnesses answered in the affirmative. We can advise you that your full written statement will be entered into the record. I thank all of you for substantial written statements that were very informative, and ask if you might keep your opening remarks to approximately 5 minutes so that we can get a good series of rounds of questions and answers on that. Mr. Foe, we'll start with you, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on such a vital and often ignored national issue. And Mr. Foster and Mr. Lutgermeyer and the rest of the subcommittee for inviting me to share my thoughts and concerns. It seems self-evident to many people, most people, I think, that a healthy industrial base is essential to our national defense. Yet over the last several decades, we have followed a national policy of allowing that base to deteriorate with little regard for our future. As a result, our supply lines for strategic parts and materials are stretched around the world. The pool of domestic workers with high-tech industrial skills needed in future national emergencies has been allowed to drain. We have accumulated massive overseas debt to China because of our trade deficit and other creditor nations that is a potential economic and national security threat. And many American manufacturing corporations, including those producing advanced technology products, now see their future and, disturbingly perhaps in the future, their corporate loyalties elsewhere. Now, in this country, we have a long, successful history dating to the beginning of the Republic of government encouraging and guiding the private sector to build and maintain a strong manufacturing base in support of national goals. But beginning in the 1980s, administrations headed by both parties have slowly adopted the posture that a strong industrial base is, in effect, not the public's business. Leave it all to the market. The problem is that the market is essentially indifferent to our country's national security. And the global market, subject to currency manipulation, mercantilist trade policies, and similar practices by potentially rival states, can be hostile. To its credit, the current administration and Congress recognize some of this and are beginning to make important initiatives. But they're still in the country and in the government and in our political discussions that we listen to every day on television and radio. There's a lack of a sense of urgency about this. Ironically, we have had a sort of industrial policy over the last several decades. But the favorite industry has not been manufacturing, but finance. So it's no surprise that while our goods markets have shrunk, we lead the world in the finance sector's major product, debt. Offshoring and downsizing manufacturing may often be in the short-run financial interests of the average investor, but at a heavy cost to the long-term interests of the average American citizen. One result of these imbalanced policies has been a continuous trade deficit for 30 years after having 100 years of trade surpluses and balance, and a growing deficit in high-technology products for the last 12. Yes, we have a trade surplus in high-technology services, but that is not necessarily good news. It represents the relentless transfer of advanced skills and knowledge to other nations. This experience, as well as economic common sense, tells us that without government leadership, private investors will not largely make the long-term commitment necessary to rebuild and retool a competitive manufacturing sector. There is no one single magic bullet that will solve this problem. We need a variety of mutually reinforcing trade, tax, procurement, currency adjustment, and other policies. But today, our economic and national security policies are too often made in separate, multiply unconnected silos. For example, there is now wide agreement that government should finance more high-tech research and development. But without a policy to assure that the products that are generated are made in the United States, it will end up subsidizing the future economies and strengthening the global power of other nations at our taxpayers' expense. Another set of silos are our policies toward China. For 20 years, one part of the government has been helping build up China's high-tech industrial capacity, while another part of the government is practicing for future conflict. Taken separately, each policy might be rationalized, but taken together, they make no sense at all. My testimony outlines a few suggestions on how we might begin to organize for more integration of our policies, including a presidential commission on linking the two areas, the appointment of select committees in Congress to deal with integrated global strategies. But whatever the most effective organizational structure, the most important point is that we urgently need an integrated national industrial strategy to promote a future for Americans that is both prosperous and secure. And my fear, Mr. Chairman, is that the time may be running out. Thank you again for taking the leadership on this issue, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Foy. I appreciate it. Mr. Barr?
Thank you, Chairman Terry, and members of the committee for inviting me here this morning to testify on this important subject. We believe the decade-long decline in the American manufacturing base is a crisis that has undermined our economic security and national security, and subscribe to all the comments that were made by members of the panel this morning. The question before us is what has happened to that prosperity and security, and what must be done to strengthen the nation's industrial base. I would like to make three main points in this testimony. One, the health of our manufacturing base and the health of our defense industrial base are one and the same, and the diagnosis is critical. Our own trade, number two, our own trade, tax, and investment and procurement policies and the globalization of production has helped create this situation. And three, it simply doesn't have to be this way. There are steps we can and we must take to revitalize our manufacturing base and our national security with policies, investments, and incentives we enact that must be both strategic and employment linked. To Jeff's point a moment ago on research and development policy. For the American manufacturing communities, this recession has just been one more big wave in a decade of economic tsunamis. Mr. Foster, your chart says it all. In a little more than a decade, we lost 6 million manufacturing jobs, one-third of our manufacturing jobs. 57,000 facilities closed. And I would make note, I'm not just speaking for the frontline skilled workers, but I'm talking about 1 million of those jobs that were engineers, designers, developers, scientists, the very core of our professional and technical capacity for innovation in this nation lost their jobs. They are out of that market. That is part of our future, and we have been wasting it away. It is a myth to think that the manufacturing base and the defense industrial base are somehow separate and independent. The National Research Council has made this point over and over, and it is in the other papers we submitted as part of our testimony, the manufacturing and security paper, that documents critical industries, critical technologies that are fading away from our economy and our expertise. And your point on the that was made about the metals is absolutely correct and straightforward, and something that's very serious and strategic consequences when China for those rare earth metals. Import penetration studies by the U.S. Business and Industry Council parallel this and show the degree of import penetration into the U.S. economy. It's dominated in 27 of 114 sectors. Over 50% of our consumption is of imports in manufactured materials, and this shows up. These are global trends, and these are economic trends that are a disaster for this country. The military policies of dual use have helped do this because we seek the cheapest vendor, the cheapest product. We find decisions made by the Navy to lease vessels rather than make them, to the Coast Guard, to make ship parts over in Korea and just assemble them here. It diminishes our capacity to address these things in the future. The threatened closures of Avondale and Ingalls Shipyard are a case in point. While we've had these warnings from the National Research Council, I think what's more poignant is watching how research and development innovation has been offshored. And nothing is more striking than the recent announcement by Intel and Applied Materials and other major technological innovators in our economy that have gotten billions of dollars of illegal subsidies and have opened major facilities in China. These are the same products that will come back to haunt us, as they already do in so many other fields. Our trade deficits, as Jeff has pointed out, are symptomatic of the rot eating away at our industrial base. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that we've lost up to 2.4 million jobs to China alone from this. And what do we know about China's strategy? Well, they target industries, they target technologies, they back it with a whole series of illegal trade practices, the leading one of which we are talking about in this Congress, and that is currency manipulation. And it is time we do something about it. A 40% subsidy goes a long way. It not only subsidizes the issue of things that are imported into our economy, more importantly, it subsidizes the research and development that's going into their economy from American firms and other international corporations. We need to take action to end currency manipulation, and House Bill 2378 does that, and this Congress should move on it immediately. The Ways and Means Committee has had it under consideration, and we had a hearing on it just this last week. The Congress has made important steps, as was noted in the Chairman's testimony. The idea that we actually need a national manufacturing strategy, that we need a trade deficit commission, that we need to take these steps forward to address a manufacturing strategy for the nation. Every other country in the world has one, and it's focused on employment and income. We do not. Shame on us. Shame on us. It's part of our problem. What you have done so far is a start, but we need to do much, much more. And we need policies and incentives, as I said before, that are strategic and employment linked, and we don't necessarily have that in the case. It is a silo effect that Dr. Foe was talking about. It is the idea that the one hand doesn't see what the other is doing here as we move on these things. We put a good policy in place around energy for clean energy production, but it's not employment linked, and therefore we stand to spend a good portion of that resource on foreign corporations producing these things. We have to be more strategic in how we do this. There are 6 things we need to do. One is about bringing fairness to the global economy. And that strengthens our laws. That means we practice Buy America, but it means we enforce our trade laws. We do something about currency. We must invest massively in this nation's infrastructure, not only just to bring it up to speed, but for the future. And we should do that strategically with employment-linked policies that, in fact, make the technologies and the things that we're going to build our country with. And the same thing needs to happen in the field of energy and our infrastructure. Again, 48C, Section 136 for autos. The idea that we are going to have loan guarantees and these things that invest in the American economy are technologies that we used to lead the world in and we no longer do. And we need to invest in these things and recapture that. It's about revitalizing the manufacturing base that protects our defense industrial base. We need tax policies that encourage investment, as Mr. Luetkemeyer talked about. We agree with you on that. We also need to get rid of the tax policies that are incentives for offshoring work. I think we have conflicting ideologies on this that we need to fix and address in terms of a strategy. And we must protect innovation, and we must invest in our R&D so that things are made here. And finally, we absolutely have to have a skilled and trained workforce for our future. As I said at the beginning, the health of our economy and our national security are inextricably tied together, and we must have a vibrant manufacturing sector to make sure it works. We must revive manufacturing as a clear centerpiece of our nation's economic and national security strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baugh. Mr. Gordon.
Chairman Tierney and members of the committee, on behalf of our members, 1,700 corporate and 83,000 individual members, I'm pleased to appear before the House Subcommittee on National Security and Foreign Affairs today to discuss the national security implications of the U.S. manufacturing policy and to present several recommendations to improve that policy. Succinctly, the U.S. manufacturing sector is of vital importance to our country, given its enormous impact across the fundamental underpinnings of our nation's security, both economic and defense-related. Manufacturing remains the largest productive sector in the overall economy at 12%, and the U.S. produces more goods than any other country, although it's close. Manufactured goods also represent 50% of the country's exports, limiting the deficit in our balance of trade. And to further bolster its importance, manufacturing generates a substantial benefit from other economic sectors, multiplying each dollar spent within the sector of manufacturing into an additional $1.41 in other sectors, higher than any other one. This raises the complete impact from the manufacturing sector to 1/4 of our GDP. An often overlooked aspect of manufacturing is not simply the size of the sector, but the fact that manufacturing creates wealth within the U.S. by producing something of higher value from materials or components. There's only 3 ways of creating wealth: dig it up, grow it, or make it. And unlike other wealth-creating sectors, manufacturing jobs are generally high-paying and represent an entree into the middle class for a large portion of the workforce. Our national security depends heavily upon our domestic manufacturing capabilities. The DoD relies upon the industrial base for leap-ahead, innovative technologies to provide combat overmatch for our warfighters, and upon trusted domestic suppliers to deliver on time and at quality. In my testimony today, I'd like to discuss 4 main themes vital to manufacturing policy: leadership, research and development, strategic capabilities, and then workforce and infrastructure. Defense manufacturing capabilities have to be elevated to a higher level in the scope of U.S. policy considerations, and this requires active and senior leadership. To crystallize this point, let me make a simple comparison. The agriculture sector represents 1% of GDP, employs 1% of the workforce, and is represented by a cabinet secretary. The manufacturing sector is 10 times larger and is represented by an assistant secretary for manufacturing and services within the International Trade Administration of the Department of Commerce. In turn, defense manufacturing issues need more senior leadership within the Department of Defense to unite policy, strategy, investment, and implementation. This is a strategic requirement above all others, and I have recently seen congressional language on this topic. Manufacturing research and development is literally the core of our national engine. 70% of R&D in the U.S. is performed by manufacturing companies, and the technology and innovation results will make the U.S. more competitive, but only if the results of the R&D stay in the U.S. and add to the GDP. But simply, if R&D stays within the U.S., it represents an investment for us. If it goes offshore, it represents simply a cost, and the country gains little benefit from the R&D. Turning to R&D for national security, the DoD has a single program that is chartered under USC Title X to develop and transition manufacturing capabilities for defense systems, the DoD ManTech program. This program has recently delivered to Congress a strategic plan titled Delivering Defense Affordability with 4 strategic thrusts, and I have referenced the executive summary with my testimony today. However, more investment is needed. A Defense Science Board study recently concluded that the proper investment level for ManTech should be 1% of RDT&E, a 3-times increase. Now, for strategic considerations, one of the most critical balancing acts that we heard today is within industrial policy is between open competition and active support or subsidy of an industry capability. Industrial capabilities in manufacturing processes, raw materials, components, and technologies are disappearing from the U.S. every day, and while some can be replaced with overseas suppliers, this is not possible for defense essential needs, where access to domestic sources is a national security requirement. Therefore, when absolutely necessary, the Department will intervene to create or sustain essential manufacturing capabilities. There's a program, the Defense Production Act, that needs to be adequately funded and fully utilized across the whole of government in order to help this. Other strategic needs are the need for steady, long-term access to affordable raw materials, counterfeit parts, environmental regulations, and visibility into the lower levels of the supply chain. An NDIA white paper titled Maintaining a Viable Defense Industrial Base lays out the technical challenges and policy opportunities for each of these issues. Finally, advanced manufacturing technologies require a workforce with core technology skills and an updated industrial infrastructure that is highly connected and enterprise-driven for the future of the U.S. An effective role for the defense industry would be as a first adopter for many of these enterprise-level advanced manufacturing practices, which would then transition to the domestic manufacturing base and help strategically position the U.S. in the increasingly hyper-competitive global economy. Chairman Tierney, I'm honored to have this opportunity to provide you with an industry perspective on the critical nature of manufacturing and be available to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. Mr. Wessel, your remarks, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Lukemeyer, other members of the committee for the invitation to be here this morning and want to testify on this important topic. First, the general disclaimer. I am here today in my individual capacity, and any views I express are my own. But as a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, let me highlight that in most of the past several years, we have issued unanimous reports by the 6 Democratic and 6 Republican commissioners. Confronting our national and economic security does not have to divide us, and it can unite us in terms of moving forward. Our national security interests have changed dramatically over the years. But while cyberspace and the electronic spectrum are increasingly important to our national security interests, there will still be a need for a U.S. presence around the globe. The requirement for actual boots on the ground will not disappear. Made in the USA may in fact be more important than it has ever been. The globalization of supply chains and the decimation of our manufacturing base have already put our interests at risk. We no longer produce enough ammunition for our troops and law enforcement. Reports are that there is no longer a domestic supplier for the propellant used in Hellfire missiles. As you noted, Mr. Chairman, we are dramatically undermined by Chinese policies regarding to rare earth minerals that we need in JDAMs and smart bombs. And as you also noted, Mr. Chairman, as we look at how other countries approach these issues, you mentioned the Switzerland example, but also France refused to grant the U.S. overflight rights for the bombing run on Libya. Turkey denied U.S. combat troops access to a northern invasion route in the run-up to the Iraq War. What would happen on a broader and longer-term basis if other countries followed their example and limited our supply of spare parts, basic components, or full weapons systems? The risks to our national security run far deeper. The first salvos in our next conflict may be lobbed in bits, bytes, and bots. The electronic spectrum is key to everything we do, and technology must be part of a secure and reliable supply chain. The growing risks that result from too many of our companies and our military abandoning the Made in America logo have increased dramatically. As the U.S. has outsourced and offshored its production, we are increasing our security risks. We aren't just letting the fox guard the henhouse. We are inviting the fox to the dinner table. Several years ago, there was a plan to procure Chinese-produced Lenovo computers for our classified systems. This would have been a huge opportunity for their intelligence services. Our procurement officials weren't originally even cognizant of the original problem. Afterwards, promises were made to update GSA's procurement regs, but to date, I'm unaware of any real change in that area. Indeed, one government entity that I'm aware of that has to go unnamed recently had to seek a specific clause in a contract with a previously cleared government contractor to ensure that equipment by the Chinese state-owned telecommunications firm Huawei was excluded from its system. Despite ongoing and increasing concerns about Huawei's activities, the Chinese technology giant continues to supply telecommunications equipment across the country for networks that could carry U.S. government traffic or other critical traffic. The risks from the globalization of supply chains in the technology area are clear. Our military and our nation's critical infrastructure are completely dependent on computers and the Internet, and they are vulnerable. As manufacturing capabilities move offshore, the basic skills of our workers are put at risk. The skills of such workers are too often taken for granted. And the decimation of our manufacturing base has an enormous impact on the strength of our economy, which is directly related to our national security. Let me quickly highlight 3 areas for action. First, in the trade area, we need to update and reform our nation's trade policies to make them results-oriented. We cannot afford to look the other way when our rights and the commitments that our trading partners have made are violated. As has been already noted, the failure to deal with China's manipulation of a currency is a perfect example of this problem. It's as much as a 40% subsidy for their exports and a 40% tax on our goods going there. How can U.S. manufacturers compete against those margins, not to mention other subsidies and predatory practices? The resulting shift in production poses risks to our national security. But by failing to address China's currency manipulation, we are also helping to fund China's massive buildup in advanced weaponry and strengthening its leadership. In procurement, we should use the leverage of our procurement dollars to support the revitalization of manufacturing sector and defense industrial base. Buy American policies are consistent with our international commitments and should be aggressively pursued as part of our procurement efforts, not only to help revitalize our manufacturing and defense industrial base, but to advance our security interests. We also need an assessment of where our defense dollars are actually going and how the globalization of supply chains may threaten our interests. And we need to do a better job of focusing our tax and economic policies on revitalizing our nation's manufacturing and industrial base through R&D. We should extend the R&D credit to first-stage deployment in domestic facilities so that products produced with taxpayer-subsidized research are actually produced here. As well, we need to examine what the migration overseas of American R&D and production by some of our companies is doing to undermine our manufacturing and defense industrial base here and enhancing the capabilities of others. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning, and I look forward to your questions and working with you and your staffs in the future.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wessel. Thank all of our panelists for very good testimony as well as the written comments that you supplied earlier. We're going to go to our question and answer period, 5 minutes per member on that, and probably more than one round if you'll bear with us on that. The United States Business and Industrial Council, a paper that was presented with some of the remarks here today, talked about import penetration. Mr. Barr, I think you made mention of that report in there. One of the quotes is that high import penetration continues to deny the stimulus-supported U.S. economy of major private sector growth and employment opportunities. Better control of the United States imports could have boosted domestic manufacturing output and overall growth by as much as $404.59 billion in 2008 alone in the 114 capital and technology-intensive manufacturing sectors examined. In essence, it's easier to sell into one's own domestic market than it is into a foreign market. So tell me, Mr. Barr, if you would, how does one get better control over U.S. imports in that situation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this was stated in terms of a number of ways. It is actually our trade policies and how we enforce them, how we deal with these questions. You know, I know the author of the paper, Alan Tomlinson from USBIC, and I can tell you a number of the things he would say. He would talk about firsthand, you have to address currency manipulation as part of this. But actually, the trade agreements we have in place, we don't enforce. We don't enforce our trade laws, and we need to do that, and we need to strengthen them. That's part of a multiple approach to this, because it's not just one thing, and there is no silver bullet to this. In terms of China, it's more than just currency. They have all forms of illegal subsidies, the lack of enforcement of standards and laws of their own country around environmental and safety and health standards and worker rights. So it's a series of actions that our trading partners engage in that we shouldn't stand for, frankly. And these things all act as incentives. It's not just the 40% on the dollar currency incentive, but all these other things are incentives for manufacturers from our country and other countries to go to China to produce to access the American market. Short and simple. And we need to stop that.
Thank you. Mr. Foe, I mean, this is not just endemic to China, and we've heard a lot about China today because I think they're a major source, but we have a number of other countries that are involved in the same types of practices, whether it's currency manipulation or subsidizing their industries, failure to enforce their own laws and regulations on environmental and safety and all of that. Are our trade agreements as they're currently structured adequate for us to address these situations, and if not, what must we do?
The trade agreements are not.
You might have to turn your microphone on. Thank you.
And as a matter of fact, they're misnamed. These trade agreements are not particularly aimed at trade so much as they are about allowing American corporations, multinationals, to invest overseas and bring the products back into the United States. We still call them trade agreements, but you know, beginning with NAFTA and going through to the entrance of China into the WTO, we have consistently negotiated on behalf of American investment interests overseas rather than American production here. This now is built into our economy. For every 1% increase in incomes in America, we have a more than 1% increase in the trade deficit. So we have a ratchet effect going on now, and that's your point about the stimulus demonstrates that. We've poured money not to create jobs elsewhere, but to create jobs in the United States in the midst of a recession, and a good deal of that, certainly, not all of it certainly, but a good deal of that just leaked out. The famous case in Texas with the solar panels, where the money was supposed to go for green technology, and it turned out that 80% of the solar panels were coming from China. Now, nobody designed that. It's now built into the way we run our economy, and that's why this is a multi-policy problem.
Thank you. Mr. Gordon, give us some short-term solutions to this.
Well, the short-term solution, I'll go back to what you talked about in terms of H.R. 4692.
Just put your microphone just up a little bit. So there you go. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll go back to the 4692 National Manufacturing Strategy. That'll essentially take a good long-term view on what you can do in the short term for tax policy as well as trade. But certainly intervention in markets which are distorted. I want to say one thing I heard you whisper. Wind turbines. Wind turbines were one of the things that also were funded. hundreds of millions of dollars, and it went to foreign manufacturers of wind turbines that were then brought back into the U.S. That's just something that did not at all meet the purposes of the stimulus funds. For Defense Department, there's a program such as the Title III program. This is the Defense Production Act Title III, and it's not simply for the DoD. It's for 8 of the largest federal agencies. It is authorities that can, I think they're found nowhere else. It's revolving fund authorities that would support any number of different national security industry capabilities within the U.S. This is one of the short-term actions that could happen if that was funded and actually implemented across all of the agencies. Currently, there's a Defense Production Act Committee that was just stood up in January of this year, and they're trying to figure out how to use these authorities across energy, across across Homeland Security, and in other agencies. To this point, there can be loan guarantees, production commitments, and other authorities that are used in order to essentially intervene in those capabilities and bring manufacturing back into the U.S. This directly combats the offshoring because it provides to corporate, to boardrooms, a required demand for the foreseeable future, and that takes the uncertainty out of the decisions, and so therefore the offshoring equation now is unbalanced, and you can bring back to the U.S. or you can preserve manufacturing capabilities in the U.S. through that Title III.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Lukemeier, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with Mr. Wessel here. We haven't gotten to him yet. You have in your testimony talked about some of the trade policies and your comments with regards to how we've gotten boxed in. What do you see are some things that we need? I know currency manipulation is one of your key items here. Is there something else in there we need to be looking at? What do you see as a way we can find a balance here to be able to keep ourselves out of hot water with our allies as well as be able to protect ourselves? What do you see we need to do?
First of all, and thank you for the question, all of this can be done in compliance with our international commitments.
You must have some special powers.
Shedding light on the issue. All of this can be done in compliance with our international commitments. So we're not talking about WTO illegality or anything else. We're talking about, number one, enforcing our laws better than we are, and creating confidence among manufacturers that actually there's a future here in America. 58% of China's exports come from foreign invested enterprises. Those are U.S. and foreign companies that have moved to China, in part hoping that they would be able to have a market to serve, but for many of them, it's the products from the U.S. are industrial tourists that go into their facilities there and come right back. We've had haphazard implementation and enforcement of our trade laws so that our companies don't know where they should invest for the future. As you've seen in the papers recently, our companies are sitting on over $1 trillion of cash. Now, if we were to take a set of policies to create confidence, one, that if you break the rules, there are going to be repercussions for that, which, it's, again, haphazard. Number two, that we're going to have a set of domestic policies that make it clear that whatever your views are on what are causing those, that there's a business climate here for the employers to be able to make the investments, R&D, all the various other things we need to do. So it is a set of policies and a mindset that, quite frankly, has not existed for a while, that needs to tell business, government, workers that we're behind you and we're going to be doing this for the long term.
In your view, if we would start enforcing the trade laws, which I've got a company that I'm well aware of and working on right now, and the individuals spent over $1 million of their own money to document a dumping charge against China, we can't get enforcement of the law. It's ridiculous. But I mean, if we would start enforcing the law and really hammering on it, in your opinion, what do you think would happen internationally? Is everybody going to start realizing that there's a new guy in town, a new sheriff in town, are going to start behaving themselves and respect us for that, or are we going to get ourselves in really big trouble?
Well, despite my party affiliation, I think probably the president who did the best job on trade over the last many administrations was Reagan, who basically said, we're going to implement the rules, we're going to be tough, and we're going to stand up for American interests. This was at a time, as you may recall, when Japan was breaking the rules right and left. And as a result of that, with the Plaza Accord, with VRAs, with what he did in the technology industry with Sematech and a number of other things, he basically said we need to have a national security defense industrial base here. And the result was our trading partners ultimately realized that they couldn't get away with this. Japan, for better or worse, started moving many of their supply chains here. As you know, last year they actually started fielding for the first time. Toyota did a team at NASCAR. I mean, they've been Americanized in a lot of different ways. Our trading partners need to understand that we're serious about enforcing our rules. We're going to stand by them. We're going to stand by our companies and our workers. And it's not going to be a question of whether you have to influence the political system. If you're being damaged, you're going to get recompense.
Okay. Mr. Foe, you in your testimony have got a number of solutions here or suggestions of things that we need to do. Can you explain a couple of them that you think are important, or identify what you believe is the most important one of those solutions that can be most impactful and something we may be able to do very short term?
That I see, Congressman, is that there is no place in the federal government where this kind of discussion takes place at the place where we can make policy. We've got these silos of policy making, and I think after so many years of continuous trade deficits, of this problem, as Mr. Wessel said, beginning back in the 1980s, that President Reagan understood, so that we know that the organizational structure doesn't work. We need in the Congress, and I think in the executive branch, we need a place where this discussion gets had and it connects with policy. My suggestion is to begin with some presidential commission on national security, which includes economic security. We have to broaden the definition of national security beyond that of the Defense Department. Second, I think there needs to be some parallel reorganization in Congress. I suggested some select committee. You are a better expert on how all of that works than I am, but I know that we've got these silos here in Congress. One of my other suggestions is that the U.S. trade representative be taken out of the cabinet. I think what's happened in trade policy is that making trade agreements has become the measure of success or failure, rather than trade policy in the service of U.S. national goals. And I think it was a big mistake to elevate the making of trade deals to the cabinet level. So I would start with those.
Okay, thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Welch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.